It's a beautiful day. I would be amazing at being retired. Hey, Josh here. We're going to be working on a table saw today, making a jig. A jig is something that's helpful with the repeatability of cuts. Instead of having to mark a line on the board every time you want to make a cut, you put it in this special jig and it always makes the same cut, the same way. This is helpful for something when you're working at angles or really anything. And make sure all the cuts are straight and the holes are plumb and the parts are square, all that kind of thing, if your jig is made well.
The jig attaches to the miter gauge, which of course runs in the miter gauge slot. You can see how it attaches here on the back. The jig itself is at 90 degrees, and the whole miter gauge is set to run at 45 degrees to the table. There's a stop block here in the back that's also cut to 45 degrees.
So why are we making all these little diamond shapes anyway? It's for this quilted pattern you can make out of wood. This is a box top with that pattern on it. It's just all those little pieces glued together. If it was going to be something larger, you'd want to glue those pieces onto a piece of plywood and then incorporate it into your project. But at the same time, it can be something simple, something small like this. This same pattern can expand out and be part of a panel for a frame and panel door, something on a nightstand, something just in a picture frame. Looks nice on the wall. It's really nice to have a dedicated jig to do this, where you're working on a project and you're like, hey, I want to include this design element. It doesn't have to be this mix of woods where the design really stands out that much. It can be something simple that you incorporate into any project you're working on. So this video today, we're going to show you how to make this pattern and glue this together. Not so much incorporate into a project just yet, just how to get a piece of wood that looks like this that then you could use for something else.
I used 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood, 18 inches long and ripped to 4 inches wide. I cut 2 of these pieces. I clamped the 2 pieces together, and after making sure they were square, I fastened them with some drywall screws. Make sure a screw isn't in the path of the blade when you're marking the jig to attach it to the miter gauge.
By the way, I tend to use these drywall screws a lot for jigs and things, mostly because I found this giant bag of them in the trash. Alright, so we're going to drill those holes for our bolts to go through. You have to make sure your bolts are long enough to go through the plywood as well as go into the back of the miter gauge and catch. You'll probably need some washers to hold the bolt head on there. So we're going to countersink these holes so the bolt head doesn't get in the way of the workpiece. For that, I'm going to use a countersink bit. Perfect.
Then I attach this new fence to the miter gauge. A little bit of paste wax on the miter gauge and the new extension jig goes a long way in making sure it slides smoothly across the table saw. Then I took a thin piece of wood and used the jig to cut it at 45 degrees.
Cool, huh? So now we have a piece cut at 45 degrees. That's going to attach to our jig here. So the pieces that run through this are going to be 1 inch wide, and to have that be the same size on each side, this little extra fence needs to be 1 inch from that saw blade kerf that we just made. So measure and screw that down. The best way I figured out how to do that is take your ruler, put it right along the back side of that fence, put that number 1 mark right at the right side of the saw blade kerf you just made, and then put a little mark there to match up your new piece too. So that seems pretty good. Let's see how it goes.
Putting down some wax paper on your work area will make sure what you're gluing together does not stick to your workbench. I just glued a few of the pieces together at a time. And as things began to dry, I then glued those pieces to each other. After the glue dries a bit, you'll want to take a wet cloth and just wipe away some of the excess.
So while that glue is drying, let's just make a simple frame to put around that fancy design we're making. I'll start by ripping some of this cypress down to about 3/4 inch thick.
To make a groove for our workpiece to fit into in the frame, I put the blade slightly lower than halfway through. Then I moved the fence over to make the groove wider to accommodate the design we made. Then you can test the fit with one of the small diamond shapes. The glue still hadn't finished drying, so I thought I would round over the edges of the piece that was going to be the frame. Next was squaring up the design so it would fit into a frame.
I've got this thin strip clamped to the table, so as I'm sanding this flat with the belt sander, the piece can stay put.
I removed the jig from my miter gauge to cut the pieces for the frame. After gluing up the frame, I applied some simple wipe-on polyurethane.
So there you go. You've got a simple table saw jig now that can cut out these diamond shapes, make patterns like this that you can incorporate into your future woodworking projects. Thanks again for watching, and please subscribe to the channel. Yep, so now I got two of the same jig.